Today, in this story, we explore a unique human ability, the power to see through the most advanced alien cloaking devices. But first, check to see if you're subscribed. It's totally free and ensures you'll never miss one of our videos. Now, let's get into the story. Neera rubbed her manipulating appendages together excitedly as she skittered down the halls of the spot station, her sectoid legs making soft tip-taps as they landed on the stainless steel floor. Her two large emerald compound eyes drank in all the information around her as she dodged another Kriya, their lobster-like abdomens scraping against one another. They raised their mantis-like bladed arms in an annoyed stance, and she wiggled her antenna back at them in apology. She was in too much of a hurry to offer a proper apology. The new species was here to look at her work, and she needed to be prepared. Her mandibles clicked together as she thought about the new members of the galactic stage. Not unlike the Vero, they were mammalian, but much smaller. The tops of their furry heads barely reached her people's lower stomachs, right at the center of her grasping appendages. Yet she had heard that they were so dense that a warrior couldn't so much as budge them, even when running full tilt. It was perplexing until she learned that they hailed from a Category 13 death world with 4.5 times the gravity of their own home world, the highest rating any planet that harbors sentient life had ever received. Sure, there was the NOA, who hailed from a Category 8 death world, but they were still relatively normal. In fact, one of her colleagues had mentioned that their scientists had told them if their gravity were any higher, they would not have made it off their planet, and that it was difficult as it was to leave the atmosphere. But that wasn't the strangest thing about them. Neera had gotten her manipulators on a pamphlet describing their anatomy, something all the other members of the galactic community had reluctantly shared only after many rotations. Their anatomy was overbuilt, would be her descriptor. They had one head, a common trait among the community, but their brain was split into two hemispheres. They had two eyes, but their eyes themselves had 6 muscles that helped move their irises. Then there was their breathing system. They had a strange way of moving oxygen around their bodies with these things called lungs, sacs of flesh that expanded and diffused oxygen into their bloodstream, which was iron-based instead of copper like herself, and needed far less oxygen than the Kriya themselves and many of the other species. In fact, their atmosphere only had 21% oxygen in it, 20% less than anyone else. It was insane and made Neera's elongated head spin. She shook her head as she stopped in front of the red airlock where she was meant to meet her guests. She could think about their crazy anatomy later. Right now, she needed to focus on presenting her work. She was quite proud of it as well. We should be nearly done showing them the lab. I should make a grand entrance, Neera thought, clacking her mandibles together loudly to get the attention of their guests. Bree turned first, her 9 eyes facing in all directions on top of her fuzzy body. The humans, she thinks they are called, turned afterward and almost immediately jumped backward, their eyes dilating to pinpoints. One of the 3 of them had placed an appendage at their hip, looking for something that wasn't there. That one had a thick bar of fur above their mouth, stark white and seemingly well-groomed. The fur atop his head was also white, smoothed back and glistening in the light of the planet below and the lights above. "It's a xenomorph," one of them whispered, their gruff voice not translating well through the translator. One of them had turned entirely white, a seemingly younger human in a green suit. He kind of looked like a cron leaf, his face entirely hairless while his head was adorned with bright gold fur. Muttering to the one next to him, "Listen, if I get face-hugged, shoot me, just shoot me," the one wearing green muttered to the one in grey, their face bright green. The one being spoken to was swallowing hard and shaking, possibly a fear response. He had less hair than his older companion, but he had a small patch of fur on his chin and no fur on his head. Neera tilted her head and slowly clicked at them in a confused way, swiveling her elongated head almost entirely around before looking back at the humans. She hadn't known they could change color. Fascinating. I do not know what a xenomorph is. I don't see anyone in the vicinity other than myself and my colleague here, she stated simply, watching their reaction. Their chests seemed to rise and fall slowly as they took a closer look at her. The older human with the fur above its mouth looked at her with predatory eyes, slowly gliding along her entire length, making her antennae stand on end. It wasn't a good sensation, and she was glad when it ended. "You're right. I apologize. You look very similar to a monster from one of our old horror movies, but you're very different. Neera rubbed her striking appendages together as she took several steps forward, towering over the humans. The young one in the green suit turned an even paler white as she did, taking several steps back himself. Strange, he could probably rip off her legs easily. How so? I don't want this to impact the demonstration. If I can alleviate any misunderstanding, I will, she said, gesturing to the other two. The older human seemed much calmer now, stroking the hair above his lip and looking up at her as she spoke. Well, to start, your head is tubular, which is very much like said species, nothing you can do about that. Then there's your back, you have biomechanical tubes poking out at about the right spots like they do, and your carapace is nearly pitch black, he stated matter-of-factly, extending a small grasping appendage as he counted off each similarity. Each one made the white human shake harder, his eyes never leaving her. But you have mantis-like arms above your grasping appendages and a more lobster-like lower half, as well as pretty large mandibles over your mouth, and you have eyes, which they don't have. So my own colleagues need to calm down and shape up, the human shouted, the last line more at his companions rather than at Neera, both of them snapping to a more upright position. He nodded and turned back to her, extending an appendage toward her own. I'm sorry about our conduct, it was a knee-jerk reaction. We were given a briefing on who we would be meeting, but in all honesty, I wasn't paying much attention to anything other than the mention of stealth ships. He made this soft, strange chuffing sound as he looked up at her, seemingly waiting for something. She looked down at him and simply stared, absorbing this information. So she was frightening to them and couldn't really do anything about it. Unfortunate, but maybe she would get to see more of those fascinating reactions. What are you doing with your appendage? She asked, pointing to it with her own manipulators. The human looked down at his, then to her, and kept his appendage held right there. It's a handshake, it's a formal greeting from my species, he grunted back, leaning forward and taking her manipulator in his hand. She assumed it was called the term, handshake, and moved it up and down like this. Neera slowly mimicked the movement until their appendages snapped. The older human's lips curled up and showed his teeth. It made her antenna twitch again, pulling her manipulator back to herself. Interesting. Well, I'm Neera, the head scientist of research and development here at the station. You're here for a demonstration of our newest stealth technology, aren't you? She clicked coyly, watching them as she skipped right ahead to the beginning of the presentation. The older human's eyes narrowed as the two younger ones smoothed their suits, the one in green no longer a pale white, the one in grey a more pink color now. Yes, we are. Strange way to jump into the conversation, he growled, the translator still having trouble picking up his voice. Don't be a grumpy bastard, Todd, she's a scientist, not a damn door-to-door salesman. The eggheads at home are just as awkward, the one in green bluntly told the older human. Todd, apparently, was his name. Neera was loving all this new information she was getting about the humans. Todd slowly looked back at the man in green without emoting, a wide grin plastered on the human in green as he grunted. Fair enough, guess I should cut her some slack. His chest expanded and shrank again before he flung his arm outward and gestured for Neera to move forward, or so she assumed, as it was quite similar to the Veyro's gesture of, get on with it. All right, lead the way, Miss Neera. Neera excitedly turned and clicked twice towards Bree, who squealed back and hopped away. This was Neera's show, and Bree knew that as she disappeared behind the airlock Neera herself had sauntered through. She turned toward the window and pulled out a data pad, tapping a few spots on its surface. Well, it's a good thing we have this amazing view, isn't it? Great backdrop for some science, she exclaimed excitedly as four long ships started coming around the edge of the planet below. The humans pressed their faces up against the glass, looking at the ships as Neera continued. As you know, our ships and those of the Alliance are quite well known for their stealth technology, but as of late, we've been running into new and better sensory equipment. After doing some reverse engineering and adding our own flavor, we've managed to create a prototype with a shield that can mask itself against even the most advanced detection equipment, she declared proudly, making herself larger as she clicked excitedly. The ships looked like they were ready to smash into the station as she spoke, one of the humans even pointing toward it as Neera snickered to herself. She tapped a button on the data pad, and the four ships quickly disappeared, the blackness of space replaced with stars. The humans' eyes grew wide, and they all stumbled back from the window. The one in grey crouched down and seemed to look around, trying to find where they had gone. "How do you do that?" he cried out in shock, the sound of it making Neera tilt her head again. Neera shook her head and flipped her datapad around so that Todd and the two others could see. This is where it gets exciting. You see, instead of using optical camouflage and traditional methods, we found a way to create a perception filter using a form of neurochemical radiation, a special wavelength we discovered that interacts with the brain, she explained, her antennae wiggling as she saw Todd's frown deepen. "But how does that work? Your species doesn't use radiation for stealth tech, and as far as we know, there's no natural way to hide from sensors like ours using neurochemicals," he muttered, scratching his chin. "That's correct," Neera agreed with a gleeful nod. "But we discovered something interesting when we looked at other species' brains. There's a region of the brain that reacts to this specific wavelength, and that's where it gets fascinating. We essentially tricked the brain into ignoring the presence of our ships. It's like a neural blind spot," she said, looking at the humans' expressions. They all looked dumbfounded, like she had just shared the secret of life itself with them. "So you're telling me that our brains just ignore the presence of your ships?" Todd said slowly, like he was trying to comprehend what she was saying. "Exactly," Neera replied, pleased with his understanding. "It's not perfect yet, there are some side effects, and we're still working on making it more effective, but it's a huge leap forward. We're planning to share it with the Alliance once we've ironed out the kinks." The humans exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from shock to something else. Neera wasn't quite sure what it was. Todd's lips slowly curled into a smile as he looked back at her. "You know, this could change everything. Imagine the possibilities if we could combine this with our own tech," he said, his voice full of excitement. Neera clicked her mandibles together, pleased with his reaction. "Exactly what we were thinking," she said. "We're looking forward to working together on this." And so, a new era of collaboration began, with the humans bringing their unique perspective and ingenuity to the table. The galaxy would never be the same.